Welcome back to Spirit and Scrutiny podcast. I'm your host, Flower. I've been thinking about what happens when you stop believing in something. Not necessarily because you discover that it was completely false. Sometimes it's much quieter than that. You just reach a point where the story doesn't organize your experience anymore. And I think that is a very strange thing to happen to a person. We don't usually experience the stories we live inside of as stories. They are just our reality. We inherit ideas about what a good life looks like, what we are supposed to want, what we are supposed to become, what makes someone look successful, what makes someone good, what love is supposed to look like, and what suffering means. Most of the time, we don't question any of it. We just live. The story is underneath of us. It's in the decisions we make without thinking about why we are making them. It is in the things that we are afraid of. It's in what we think will finally make us feel like we are doing life correctly. And then sometimes something happens. Not necessarily one enormous revelation. Sometimes you just notice a crack. Something doesn't make sense to you anymore. Something you once believed with complete sincerity feels borrowed. And once you see that, you can't quite go back. That's the part that I find interesting, because we have this idea that questioning something is supposed to lead somewhere. You question the old belief, and then you discover truth. You leave the old way of thinking behind, and then you find a new and better one. There's supposed to be a next chapter. But what if there isn't one yet? What if the old story has stopped working and you haven't found another story that deserves to take its place? I think that is much more uncomfortable than we tend to acknowledge. Because a belief just isn't an idea. If you actually lived according to it, it has consequences. It has shaped your choices, influenced what you've pursued and what you've avoided. It has probably influenced what you've considered meaningful. So, when that belief loses its authority, you're not simply changing your mind. You're standing inside of a life that was partially built around something you no longer completely believe. And that is a different kind of problem. It's almost architectural. You can remove something that was holding a structure together and then suddenly realize much of the structure was depending on it. I think human beings are constantly doing this with meaning. We want to make our lives make sense. I don't think that's a flaw. I think that is deeply human. We want to understand why we are here. We want our suffering to fit somewhere. We want our own experiences to belong to a larger story. We want to know that what we are doing matters. And maybe our lives do have some larger meaning. But there's a difference between reality having meaning and us being able to explain that meaning. Those aren't necessarily the same thing, and I've become much more interested in that distinction, especially spirituality. Because spirituality can give us a language for things that are very difficult to explain. It can give us a way of understanding experiences that don't fit neatly into the ordinary categories we use to understand the world. I think that is very, very beautiful. But I also think spirituality can become another place where we rush to fill an empty space. Something happens that we can't explain, and almost immediately we decide what it means. Oh, it was a sign. It was meant to happen, part of the lesson. It was the universe telling me something. Maybe. I don't know. I've started to think that those 3 words might actually be some of the most spiritually honest words that we have. I don't know. Not because nothing matters. Not because I've stopped caring. Not because we've stopped caring. But because sometimes we care enough not to pretend. There was a time when I wanted spirituality to tell me what things meant. I wanted to understand what was happening underneath of everything. Wanting to see the pattern. I wanted to know what the experience was trying to teach me. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But I'm not really interested in having everything explained to me anymore. Because eventually the explanation can become more important than the experience itself. And then you aren't really encountering reality anymore. You're encountering your interpretation of reality. That's a subtle difference. And I believe it's a really fucking big one. Maybe something can be sacred without me knowing exactly what it means. Maybe something can change me without me knowing why it happened. And maybe mystery isn't something that we have to solve. Maybe sometimes it's something we have to learn how to stand inside of. I think that's one of the things that is harder about outgrowing an old worldview. You don't only lose the belief. Sometimes you lose the feeling of knowing where you stand. And that is where we become tempted to replace it. Because uncertainty is so uncomfortable. You want somewhere to put your feet. So you find another explanation, another philosophy, another person who seems to understand things, another system that makes the world feel coherent again. And sometimes that is exactly what you need. But sometimes I also wonder if we move too quickly. If we're so desperate to replace the old story that we don't give ourselves enough time to find out whether we actually believe the new one. I've come to learn that maybe there is great value in the space between beliefs. Maybe you can know something that no longer feels true without immediately knowing what is true instead. It sounds simple, but it's actually difficult because you still have to live. You still have to make decisions. You still have to decide what matters. You still have to figure out how you want to treat people. And you still have to wake up and choose to participate in your own life. You have to do all of that without necessarily having some grand philosophy sitting neatly underneath of every decision. Maybe that's part of becoming a grown-ass person, becoming an adult. Not being certain, but being capable of making honest decisions while knowing that your understanding is incomplete. I've spent a lot of time believing that I eventually would understand enough to feel like I had arrived somewhere. That there would be some point where everything I'd experienced would arranged into like a perfect little coherent picture. And while maybe that is possible, I'm not really interested in that being true so much anymore, because when I look back at my own life, some of the things I once thought were permanent truths were really just the truths I needed at that particular time to help me understand something, survive something, to give me a language for something. And then eventually they stopped being enough. I don't think that that means that they were necessarily worthless. It might just mean that they were temporary. And I think that is a very difficult thing to accept about our own beliefs. We want to know that if something mattered to us once, that it must remain true forever, but that's not how understanding works. Maybe you can be sincere and still be wrong. Maybe you can believe something deeply and eventually discover that you were only seeing part of it. Maybe changing your mind isn't always a failure of conviction. Maybe sometimes it's evidence that reality has given you something new to consider. There's a humility in that I value much more now. Not the humility of thinking you're incapable of knowing anything. That's not what I mean. I mean the humility of remembering that your understanding is always going to be smaller than the thing that you are trying to understand. That feels especially important when we are talking about spirituality. Because if there is something larger than us, God, consciousness, nature, reality, whatever language you choose to use for it, it would be very strange to assume that we could completely contain it inside of our own explanations. Maybe the sacred doesn't become less sacred because I don't understand it. Maybe reality doesn't become less meaningful because I can't explain it. Maybe I don't have to reduce mystery into certainty in order to have a relationship with it. I know that is where scrutiny has become important to me. Not because I want to destroy belief. Actually, quite the opposite. I scrutinize things because I want to know what can actually survive being looked at closely and what can't. Because I don't want beliefs that require me to stop asking questions. I don't want beliefs that become part of my identity to the point where questioning them feels like threatening myself either. I want to be able to say, I believe this, but also I could be wrong. Those two things can exist together. Maybe that is what intellectual honesty looks like. And maybe there is something spiritual about it too. Because if I'm genuinely interested in truth, then I have to be willing to discover that something I love isn't true. Otherwise, I'm not really interested in truth. I'm interested in being right, and those are two very different things. I think that is something this season has been moving toward without me necessarily realizing it. When I look back at these conversations, I don't think that I've been moving towards some grand new belief. I've been examining the things I thought I needed to believe. I've been pulling apart some of the assumptions underneath spirituality. I've been thinking about healing and what it actually means to become more whole. I've been questioning the impulse to escape the ordinary human life in search of something more profound, and maybe that is why this feels like such a strange place to be at the end of a season. Because I don't have a grand conclusion for you. I actually think I'm less interested in one than when we started. And maybe that is not a disappointing ending. Maybe it's just an honest one. Because what happens when the stories that once organized your reality lose their authority? For a while, you might feel lost. You might feel untethered. You might miss the certainty. You might even miss a belief that you know you can't honestly return to. We are allowed to admit that. We don't have to romanticize the uncertainty. It isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it is just uncomfortable and you want to know the answer. Sometimes you want someone to tell you what it all means. But maybe the point isn't to become someone who never wants an answer. Maybe it is to become someone who can tolerate not having one immediately without inventing another. That's different. And I think that is where I'm finding myself now. Not at some grand new truth, not at the end of the search, just somewhere after some of the old explanations have stopped being convincing, and before I know what comes next. And strangely enough, I'm beginning to feel that that's okay. Maybe I don't need to fill the space immediately. Maybe I can just live here for a while and pay attention. See what remains, see what survives, see what turns out to be real when I'm no longer forcing anything to fit into the story that I thought I needed. Because life doesn't stop when we're figuring it out. That's the thing. You don't get to pause your life until your worldview is complete. You still wake up. You still love, lose. You still have ordinary days. You still get to decide what kind of person you are and are going to be. Perhaps that's where the real test of a belief is. Not whether it sounds profound, not whether it gives you a beautiful explanation, but whether it makes you more honest, more responsible. Whether it makes you more capable of loving without losing your discernment. Whether it leaves enough room for reality to surprise you. Because I don't think I want a spirituality that protects me from reality. In fact, I know I don't. I want one that helps me meet it. Even when it's inconvenient, disappointing, and even when I don't understand it. Maybe that's actually what I'm looking for right now. Not another story to live inside of, but something more honest than that. A way of being aware enough to notice when the story and the reality have begun to separate, and brave enough to let the story go when they do. I don't know what comes after that. I think for once, I'm okay with not knowing. Maybe that is the point. not to arrive at the end of the question. Maybe the point is to become someone who can stay honest while the question is still open. That's where the next part begins. Not with an answer, but with the willingness to keep looking. Thank you for spending this time with me. And thank you for being here for Season 1 of Spirit and Scrutiny podcast. We've spent this season asking questions that, at least for me, didn't always make things simpler. I think they've made them more honest, and I'll take that. There is just one more episode left of this season, and I don't think I want to close this season by pretending that we've arrived anywhere. I think I'd rather leave the door open, because curiosity doesn't require certainty. Maybe it actually requires the opposite. Enough humility to admit that reality might still surprise us, and I hope it does. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep asking the questions that bring you closer to truth.